Guyana with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of Dubai. When you are born, your parents pay nothing. Your delivery and checkups for the next 9 months are all free. Then you grow up and you go to school. Local school in Dubai is free. And so are universities, because Dubai will pay for you to get a degree.
I studied at Zayed University and New York University, both for free.
Who's gonna pay for that?
The government.
Then you get married. If you can't afford the wedding, you get $20,000 to throw a wedding. And after marriage, every local Dubai family gets this: free land. Did you get free land?
Yes.
Did you get free land?
Yes.
Did you get free land?
Sure, yes.
And if you cannot afford the home, then you get a grant to build it for free.
I also can't afford building a house. I can get a 0-interest loan on housing.
Zero?
Zero.
If you need to go to the hospitals are free. And if you need surgery that's not available here, they will fly you to another country to get treatment for free. When you become a senior citizen, you get discounts, many discounts. And if you live alone and can't afford it, Dubai will even send a caretaker to look after you for free. And when you die, well, in Dubai, that's also free. Your funeral will be taken care of, and Dubai will build a full tent with air conditioning within 5 hours of your death next to your home, so your friends can come and say goodbye to you.
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
So welcome to another edition of Globespan 24/7, owned and operated by Mr. Nohar Singh, with our technical operator, Mr. Devin Bisram. Tonight we are discussing economic equity. Is there economic equity in a majoritarian political democracy? Before we get into the subject matter, let me introduce our very fine, distinguished guest for tonight, Mr. Ravi from Guyana, former parliamentarian and leader of ROAR. We have two distinguished professors, in fact, three distinguished professors, Professor Baytoram Ramharack of New York, Professor David Hinds from Arizona, but he corrected me last time that he is from Guyana, and Professor Terrance Blackman of Medgar Evers College. And then we have Mr. Deon Abrams, who served as co-host and probably will do that again tonight. So gentlemen, welcome all to our program tonight. Can there be economic equity in a majoritarian political democracy? There are two concepts here, which I'll ask our esteemed professors to define: the concept of economic equity and majoritarian political democracy. So first, let's ask our in-house political scientist, Professor Baytoram Ramharack. You want to talk about what is meant by economic equity and majoritarian political democracy?
Well, first, let me say, Dr. Bisram, congratulations. I've seen in the last month you've actually won every award there is
Thank
of
you.
significance
Thank you
to
very
win. So
much.
congratulations on that. All right. So this is a topic which I think it's important, for us to address, and I'm sure all of us have some indication as to what we may mean. So there are some nuances. But in my mind, People always compare, just for your viewers to understand, when we talk about equity, it's not the same thing as equality, right? Equality, to use a simple example, would be, let's say, an example is you give two villages, let's say if it's an African, Amerindian, or an Indian village, you give all of them a brand new pair of shoe. So in that sense, everybody's getting, something equal. However, the concept of equity comes into play when you have situations where those shoes that you give to people may not necessarily, fit. It may not work for some people. So some people may have a better opportunity to walk in those shoes, right? So the whole notion of equity is you're looking at creating conditions that give everybody a sort of equal chance to be able to be successful. So equity and equality are essentially two different concepts, right? But now I guess we can talk more about what that means politically, right? The other concept here in the title that we're using is this whole question of majoritarian political democracy, right? We've defined the topic with that term. When we think of majoritarian political democracy, we're thinking of a situation where one group, especially in ethnically divided, people will say racially divided societies, where one group may have a certain advantage in gaining access to political power, right? Whether that's because they have a majority of the population. In the case of Guyana, we can make an argument that the PPP, for instance, in a divided politics, in 1980, the population of Indians was about almost 52%, right? I think it was 51.9. So therefore, if you look at politics from a pure majoritarian sense, you can make an argument that, well, it is easy for this population, right, Indians, to win elections, right? And they can do that into the future. However, we have seen that has changed, and primarily because, from the 1980s, this was the height of the Barnum era, where a lot of Indians, Africans, and so on have also migrated. But the Indian population today, as far as we know, is about 40%. I think it's less. But my point is, it's not a majority of the population. So when we talk about majoritarian political democracy and translate that concept into elections, it means that you don't have a situation where one political party has an advantage. And I think this is a fundamental issue that is being missed by people who talk about, the whole notion of majoritarian politics. When we talk about inclusionary politics, that's a different concept. We can talk about that. But in conclusion here, my point is the situation in Guyana has changed. We are now or at least the two major ethnic groups, which neither of them has a majority support, can have equal attempt to gain electoral victory if they can work in some kind of a coalition arrangement to win elections or win over certain sections of the mixed population, which happens to be the growing population in Guyana, or the Amerindians, which stands to about 12% of the population today. So majoritarian politics today is very different. So we are now entering into a more competitive political arena in Guyana. I don't want to monopolize, so I'm going to stop there.
Professor Hinds, you want to critique, add?
No, except to say that when one talks about equity, one is talking about a society in which the different groups, whether they be social groups or ethnic groups or racial groups, whether each group, given its own history, given its own condition, is given the resources, is afforded the resources of other groups, and so therefore equality becomes the objective, but you have to have some form of equity in the distribution of resources. We are accustomed to talk about equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. What we don't talk about is equality of condition. And that if you don't have equality of condition, then that's where the challenge comes for those who are distributing the resources, a la the government. The government has to always bear in mind the equality of condition, and that's where you start with equity. If one group begins the race in 1948, and another group begins the race in 1988, and you give them the same degree of resources, you're not dealing with equity. You're giving them equal resources, but it's not equity. One is gone since 1948. And so that equity becomes a much more complex subject engaged, because it has to take into consideration a whole set of factors than simply say, well, you know, I give you 10 cents and I give the other one 10 cents. So that it's a complex formulation. In terms of majoritarian democracy, it is what it is. The majority wins and the majority governs. Now, when you add democracy to majoritarianism, it might not necessarily fit neatly, because one may argue that majoritarianism by itself is a tyranny of the majority. And that does not square up necessarily with the democracy. So the jury is out in whether majoritarianism itself leads to democracy. Now, we know that in societies that are sharply divided along ethnic lines and so forth, religious lines and so forth, that whole question of majoritarianism comes into play. Can majoritarianism lead to a democratic polity in sharply divided societies? Now, telling me that there is no ethnic majority, really, it's just fiddling with terms. At the end of the day, governments come into being from elections, and you can have a plurality in the society, meaning you're 40% of the population and the other one is 30, and your 40% can become a majority, depends on how many people from your side go out to vote. You see, the numbers in the population, the size of the population is not necessarily the size of the electorate. The electorate is what decides government, not population. And I hear people bandy that thing around. You know, you can still have a large plurality in the population, and that can be easier converted to a majority than another group with a small plurality. I mean, Amerindians make up 9, 10, 11% of the population. They are further away from enjoying majority status. Africans, they say 30%, Indians 40%. Those two are closer to converting their plurality to a majority, either by inflating their turnout or suppressing the turnout of other groups. Governments are elected by electorates, not population. And so, therefore, the whole notion of majoritarianism is not synonymous with size of population. It is the size of the electorate, and on election day, who turns out to vote.
Okay, let's hear Professor Blackman. Professor Blackman, what's your take on the concepts of economic equity, majoritarian rule, democracy?
So good evening, colleagues, and thank you for putting this discussion into the mix. I think it's an important one. And I think that I agree with Baytoram and with Dr. Hinds in the sense that, economic equity has to be distinguished from economic equality. So from my perspective, economic equity is really referring to a fair, just, but these are words that we have to think through. And I think that that's what Dr. Hinds was sort of just getting at. What do we mean by a fair and just distribution of economic resources, a fair and just distribution of opportunities, a fair and just distribution of the benefits within a society? But that's the notion that is encapsulated in equity. So we're aiming to ensure that everyone, as Baytoram noted, has an equal chance to access the resources that they need to meet their basic needs, pursue their goals and aspirations. That's what we want. And as he rightly noted, economic equity is often conflated with, I think, economic equality, which is, as he tried to describe, a concept that kind of refers to the equal distribution of resources and income across the population. And both of these ideas are important for promoting social and economic justice and achieving some kind of harmony within the society. But I think both Baytoram and Dr. Hinds are correct in noting that achieving economic equality is much more difficult, and it might not be possible, or perhaps I would go even further, it might not be the most desirable thing in practice, right? Because we've already seen what societies that are focused around economic equality sort of looks like. And this it moves us in a direction of at some point forcibly equalizing resources and income. And at the moment you have to go in that direction, then you begin to restrict individual freedoms,
the end of 2019,
etc. So I think equity is the issue. I would deepen the definition that has been proffered thus far. So when I think economic equity, and I think this is where Dr. Hinds was going, you want to address the systemic barriers and inequalities that prevent certain individuals or groups from accessing the resources and the opportunities that they need to succeed, right? So this then means that you have to address issues of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, unequal access to education, healthcare, and other sort of essential services of that type. And now to broaden this to the context of a kind of, can we achieve economic equity within this? So I will go with the earlier formulation of a sort of winner take all rather than view in a winner take all political framework. And it's going to be difficult. And I think that's why I said at the beginning, I think it's good that we're beginning to take on this conversation, because if you economic equity is sort of, we have defined it in terms of addressing poverty, unemployment, discrimination, unequal access to education, healthcare, is going to be difficult to achieve within a winner-take-all political framework, for the simple reason that such a framework will prioritize the interests of the winners over the losers. I mean, there's no point in pussyfooting around that, right? If I win, I will prioritize my interests, and this will lead to, and we've already seen, and I think that this is where we need some nuance. We've already seen that this will lead to the kinds of policies that we're arguing about, we have been arguing about over many weeks, which is policies that concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a small number of individuals and leave many people behind. And I think that's the challenge for us in a way. How how to achieve some degree of equity within our current winner-takes-all framework. We've seen all of the efforts as they relate to constitutional change and so on. How do we get this political system to promote, fair competition, to, protect the rights of workers, consumers, and so on, and to ensure that the economic benefits are more widely shared? And this takes on an added urgency within the context of Guyana at this moment. So that's what I would say as a start place. So I think the question is, it is naive to assume that the winner-take-all framework will not prioritize the interests of the winners. So even as you prioritize the interests of the winners, how do we ensure that the losers don't lose everything and all the time? And I think that that's the question, perhaps, for us to continue to ponder here this evening.
Yeah. So before we answer the question, let's hear from Ravi, Dev, and then Deon about the definition put forward so far.
Well, I think it's very good that we've had some professors on the panel who can give us an inkling of these two key terms. And I also agree that, these are threshold issues that maybe we should have approached earlier. Now, equity, we know the term is a protean one. It has been altered through time, different societies, different ideologies. There's varying notions of what is equitable. As a boy, we had both Chetty and Burnham were Marxist oriented. And Marx, of course, in talking about equity, economic equity, he phrased it that he was operating in a capitalist system where self-interest ruled all, and the big fishes will eat little fishes. He then proposed a system where, an intermediate system, where he says that from each according to his ability, to each according to his output. He said that's a socialism midway thing. And I think both Burnham and Jagan were committed to that. Marx also pointed out a different definition of equity under a different system as society progresses or as society moves forward. So he says from each according to his effort, to each according to his need. Marx brought in the whole notion of human needs, that these must be satisfied. So two things I want to point out from that. That one, equity is not a stagnant notion. It is one that is fixated in time and place. And we have to then unpack that for whatever society we are living in, right? We can't remain at the normative level. When I came back from the States to return to Guyana in '88, I talked a lot about Rawls' justice as fairness as the basis of an equitable system in Guyana. But times have changed. Even in America, Rawls is not spoken about much, but when I went over there in '72, that was the big thing. He revolutionized political theory. But so to come back to it, again, I want to emphasize that if we are to talk about equity, and equity is a changeable notion, we have to, first of all, how we call a descriptive notion of equity in our society, in our Guyanese society. And so, for example, when I hear David talking about equity, and when I hear Ramharack talking about equity, there's a different focus. And I would believe that that focus comes about from two, not necessarily contradictory, but they are not on all fours as one, as to how they see equity in terms of that. The other point I want to make about equity before we move on, that it is changeable. Nowadays, Marx isn't mentioned. His notions, and I'm surprised that my good friend David didn't even genuflect to Marx, and he comes out of that tradition. And at least we ought to, note that at a minimum. in honor of Walter. But to come back to where we are today, and this is what I've been trying to get over, maybe not as good as I ought to have, but we are in a neoliberal paradigm that came on stream by the end of the 70s. And what is this neoliberal paradigm has pushed in terms of equity is a movement away from equality, which was implicit in Marxism and, in all its offshoot, whether European Marxism or C.L.R. James's Marxism or whatever you want to call it, and move towards a more, to use the word neoliberal, meaning to bring back the original thoughts about equity, which is one from market transaction. So we are living at a time when, if you look at, and I looked at the definitions that take preponderance in Google, they all talk about matching merit and that's effort with merit with rewards. That's what they match it. Back in the day when I was again in Brooklyn College, at that time there was a whole notion about do you reward Will Chamberlain as the same as any pedestrian basketball player? They were talking about merit. Will, Stilt was a super basketball player. And with that, I'd like to note that LeBron James has just passed my hero, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, today as the greatest scorer in basketball history. Phenomenal. Should LeBron then get the same amount of money as a player out of the Brooklyn schoolyards? We don't think so. So there's one. So that view has now risen to the top. That we are stressing quote unquote merit rather than equality. So we ought to know that. So and again, what I want to advise them that in Guyana, I think the political players have to be clear about what they mean by equity, because I hear the players talking at each other rather than to each other, and there's a lot of confusion. Burnham and Jagan didn't have much confusion. They were agreed on the normative principle of what equity meant. So they could now criticize each other. Boy, are you giving enough there? Because they both agreed as to how the principle of distributive justice. Right now, I don't think the two parties in Guyana, while they all both give lip service to the neoliberal principles, I don't think they agree. That's one. The second question was about majoritarian politics. And here again, I think we need to move from the abstract normative principles that might have come out of Greek politics. And where are we today? Because we have that 2,500 years of history to guide us. And what we discovered in Guyana is that, as Baytoram pointed out, if there's a built-in majority in any one of the ethnic groups, then at the mobilization time when the two parties went their own separate way, PSG and PPP, it was almost a no-brainer that they would mobilize a long race, leaving Mr. Burnham with a disadvantage, which he then chose one way of dealing with. But it was a rational choice from that standpoint. So where are we today? Between the 60s and today, there's been a tremendous amount of debate between two other forms of democracy. One would be consociationalism, which Baytoram wrote one of the first papers in Guyana about around 1994, which is what we popularly call power sharing, where the major parties come together and they sit around the table and in proportion to their numbers, they have some influence. Sometimes the smaller one would be given a veto power, like how we have to appoint the Chief Justice and the Chancellor. The opposition has veto power. We see what that can lead to, immobilism. You can't move, you're stuck with people for two decades. So to come back to it, in Guyana, I think David is not giving enough credence to this fortuitous demographic change that we have had. And this is not theory. We know that from a position where the PPP could win elections without thinking. And when I was in Parliament, I was on the opposition benches. And when Ralph, the Speaker, would call for a vote, he wouldn't even lift up his head. You get me? He knows how they'll vote. But by 2011, after people like myself had talked about a new kind of politics with the new demographics, you had a hung Parliament. That was real. And in 2015, the government changed. What I want to emphasize, and I'm talking specifically to David, because he, I think, represents a different tendency rather strongly to consider that if Mr. Granger had acted as politicians are assumed to act in a rational sense and not close those sugar estates, which might have been an economic decision, but David himself, Professor Thomas himself, the Commission of Inquiry itself recommended it not be shut down. Mr. Granger, for whatever reason, I hope one day he'll tell us, chose to go that route. And he made an economic decision that had political ramifications that, in a sense, blew up in his face. I want to say right now that there's a premise that the same premise that operated pre-2011, that somehow the Indian vote is monolithic. Just like how before it was thought that the African vote was monolithic. Walter proved that the African vote was not monolithic, and I think the AFC proved that the Indian vote was not monolithic. It depends on the circumstances. I really do believe that if we have a type of politics as Horowitz, who opposed consociationalism for several reasons, he called it centripetalism, that there were innovations in several countries. For example, the alternative voting, the single transferable vote, which was to give an incentive to voters to vote for moderates. What we have in Guyana today, the demographics itself, is forcing Guyanese to vote for moderates in these parties. So the moderates in both parties have to stand up. And I think at this stage, Mr. Norton is under, and I said it clearly, and David is here. We don't have to hold back any, of our words with them. I see David and one section of the opposition pushing Mr. Norton for a more strident, for a more confrontational type of politics. And I think that is fatal to a successful electoral politics in the demographics that we have now. And it is not in the interest of the constituency, which still remains Mr. Norton's base.
Mr. Deon?
Mr. Abrams, you're on mute.
Ravi's last point is interesting in that the idea of David and others pushing for a confrontational approach to politics, which in essence he's arguing may be a no-win situation for the opposition. But I would also factor in that the push is coming from the government itself. And we have to factor that push into the equation, because the government is pushing by its policies for confrontation. With respect to the equity and all of that, I will not delve much into that, but the idea, because the scholars have already given their views, but I do believe that David's point about the factor of race is important, even though Ravi believes that in some ways the demographics really can be shifted. The key factor, barring the racial divide, that would have caused the win for the APNU in 2020, and he did mention it, is the fact that the AFC was able to pull Indian votes, but it was not the PNC that did that, right? So the alignment is still there. When he was in Parliament, he himself was able to pull a fraction of the Indian vote. So the swing in terms of the ethnic parties, the PNC and the PPP, we don't see that demographic shift in terms of an overriding presence of Indian votes for the PNC and an overriding presence of African votes for the PPP. So if these two parties are still the major contestants, then we still have to consider the majority in terms of race. We cannot dispel that. I think I'll end with that.
Okay, so Professor Blackman introduced a very important new term, a new concept, somewhat related to majoritarian. He said, winner takes all. Professor Ramharack, winner takes all, regardless of whether it is an ethnic majority or not, isn't it?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I'm getting some
Winner takes all, whether it is an ethnic majority or not. So in Guyana politics, Professor Blackman is basically saying it doesn't matter because the winner still is like a sort of an autocracy, an authoritarian government in some sort of way, in that they run the show.
Well, okay, there are a couple of things here, right? When we talk about moving from the normative to what is reality in Guyana, we're looking at a system that does give power to the winning party, right? Winner takes all, in my mind, it's pretty much a situation where one group that has power has a lot of power. So it's not just winning an election, right? That win is translated into enormous power. And of course, we can talk about the history of, the Barnumite Constitution and so on, and all of the structures that were put in place, whether it's about, paramountcy of the party and so on. So certainly if you win an election, and if you have one section of the population is not part and parcel of that process after the election is over, let's say if one party assumes that win or cheats to win, and they have that amount of power, then what we have seen in Guyana, at least, from 1960, well, I'd say about 1968, when you had that, first election, you have a situation where one dominant party, right? Let's assume, the party had won the election in 68, but that party began to amass a tremendous amount of power as they govern, right? And we can talk about all the reasons why. But to come back to your question, we can't divorce ourselves from the fact that you're looking at a very divided polity. Now, arguments have been made that since 1956, 55, 56, the split in the original PPP was not, it was not necessarily based on race. But the problem with that argument is that if you take the focus away from the key players, right, who were part and parcel of that history, but look at the rank and file, the people who are at the bottom, the voters, the electorate, when you look at it from that perspective, you see race playing a major role. So certainly ethnicity was there. But in the Guyanese terms, when we talk about winner take all, it means that the party that is seen as representing a specific political, a specific ethnic group begins to dominate power and do whatever they feel that is necessary to entrench themselves in power. So we have a situation today where, again, within this divided politics, whether it's perception or whether it's reality, there was a conflation within what is reality and what is perceived. So the point I'm trying to make here is that it doesn't matter the extent to which the governing party, namely the PPP, attempts to govern, whether it's by practicing through, inclusive governance, or whether it's promoting a policy of one Guyana, the perception will always be there. Now, this brings me to another point, which we seem to be, discussing here, and hopefully we can get into that in terms of operationalizing, what this whole notion means in terms of equity and political power. I don't see a situation where within the opposition, where you have, moderates, and then you have a handful of radicals. I think that division is very artificial. Now, granted, I'm not saying, that there is nothing wrong in Guyana. Obviously, there are tremendous problems. And I think that the basic problem is we don't have a national dialogue, right, between both sides. And of course, you have a situation where, there are excesses that are being perpetrated, and we have to speak out about those things, whether it's or in Boston. I think the way the government is handling epidemiology, it's a situation which they could have avoided. But at the same time, we also have a situation because of this ethnic division where every single thing that this government does is being seen from the perspective of race, whether it's Letitia James, whether it's anything that this government seems to be doing, race seems to be a dominant factor. So that's one point. And the other point I'm trying to make is that I don't see that moderate element, which has been missing, and that is actually a fault of the PNC, given what they have tried to do in 2020 and previously in terms of rigging elections and so on. So I think that tragedy exists, and it creates an opening for other radical elements, to be much more influential within the party. So on the one hand, you have the absence of that sort of moderate wing. I'll give you a simple example. People would argue that people like Nigel Hinds, one of the most outstanding, intelligent, reputable attorneys in Guyana. But here is a person who can make an argument, about what is the half of 65. Nigel Hinds can talk about on an Emancipation Day, the fact that, well, hey, this is Guyana. Africans came here first. Everyone else came later. That speech has been wiped out from the internet. So I don't see a lot of differences within that sort of moderate element, and I don't know where it exists. So I see that conflation. So the point I'm trying to make here is that within this ethnic divide, we were seeing an opposition, and I could say the same thing, for the ruling party to a certain extent. I see the opposition as digging a hole to fill a hole, to borrow a sort of a slogan, a proverb from Guyana, because anything that this government does, it seems like it is going to be seen as racial. And I don't want to put, David in the hot seat. So my question, in my head is, what does the opposition, or more specifically, since David is here, what exactly do you want in terms of, instead of criticizing everything that this government does and seeing race in every policy that this government adopt, what exactly do you want in terms of how do you see Guyana, moving in what direction? Can you name 3 or 4 things that we could say, look, these things are credible, right? Let's talk about these things. And these are the things David Hinds, believe can promote equity in Guyana.
David, you want to take up the challenge?
Equitable distribution of power. Very simple. Equitable distribution of power. I am not going to be tied down to specific things. When one side doesn't have power, one side doesn't have power.
Political parties contest to win elections, and once you win election, they want the ability to govern. So how are they going to be able to share or divide power equally?
Well, if you've been following me, you'll know I am not a fan of this election business as an end in itself. I understand that you have to have elections, but I do not believe that elections have solved anything in Guyana and will solve anything in Guyana. Ravi and I used to be fellow travelers with the power sharing thing, and he has abandoned me now. Here is the story. When the Indians were a majority, a settled majority, and Africans were a minority. The African Party made a rational decision, as Ravi said, that we have to engage in electoral fiddling in order to get power and hold the power. Now that neither group is a majority, we are back at the same point where now both groups, both parties have decided we have to fiddle with the election to get that extra. Look, back then it was one. Now, both, as the 2020 election showed, that both parties are willing to fiddle to get that extra seat or 2 seats that Ravi's talking about. And I am not prepared to join Ravi in that, in championing a model that encourages rigging now from both sides. Because that's where you are going when you're talking that, well, this one has to get crossover voters. Deon said there are no crossover votes, all right? The Indian votes that voted for the majority came through the AFC, all right? And as Ramharack pointed out, the PPP can do whatever they want in the African community. They're going to attract the elements who caused the trouble for them in Buxton the other day, all right? They're not going to attract real bona fide voters. And so we are back now. How do you get this majority of 1 seat or 2 seats? You have to fiddle with the election. And both sides are going to now be encouraged to fiddle with the election if we don't arrive at a formula to dissuade them from fiddling with the election. And that is why I still hold very strongly to a power sharing formula as both a deterrent, but also an opportunity for a more democratic and equitable government. I am not saying that power sharing in itself would stop the attempts to rig, but I think it's an effective deterrence, since both sides at the end of the election will realize whether they quote unquote win or lose, they are going to be part of the exercise of power. And in terms of power sharing, solving problems, I don't know that it will solve the problem, but I think it will put the country on a better footing to solve these problems. So that is why I can't join Ravi on this thing that both sides could win. Precisely because both sides could win, they are going to rig to try to win, as they both attempted to do, or they both did in 2020. It's okay to say one side attempt, but the results of the recount show that the other side didn't attempt. The other side rigged the hell out of the election before election day, right? And that is what we are encouraging when we tell both sides that you can win. For me, that is not sustainable. We have to find a mechanism, like I said, to deter them from rigging and to encourage them to work together. So that's where I stand on this governance. I do not think that under a winner-take-all system, and I'm not going there in theory, I'm going there that what I have seen and studied from 1957 to the present. The government that comes into being, somebody said it here tonight, I think Dr. Blackman, the government that comes into being is going to look after the interest of its constituency or the interest of its party. And I think that evidence has been consistent. And to think that one party can win an election when the other side doesn't believe it legitimately wins. And so that party is going to represent the interests of those who did not vote for them. I don't think it has happened, and I don't see it happening within the present framework. No, I do believe there is a representative kind of governance that is going on. And I think this PPP government, if not the previous ones, but the current PPP government that's introduced a model where you look after your party interests and your constituency interests to some extent first. And then you throw some little crumbs at the constituency of the other side. Now, in theory, I do not have a problem with a party winning an election with 1 or 2 seats and say, look, I have to satisfy my constituency for me to remain in power. I have no problem with that. The challenge for the party is how do you do that without hurting the interests and hurting the well-being of the other constituency. And if what is going on now under this PPP government, they're being very clumsy about it because they are representing the party interests and to some extent, their constituency interests, but they're doing so by crushing the interests of the other group, and that's where I part company with them. I think under the present circumstances, it is difficult to do the two. And so we have to have a new governance structure which allows a party to represent the party interests and the interests of its constituency while not crushing the interests of the other constituency. Now, before I stop, I just want to address Ravi's formulation that I represent a politics that is pushing Norton to confrontation. I am a radical. I make absolutely no apologies for that. Ravi said that I come out of the Marxist tradition, but I also come out of a radical tradition. All right? Now, there's a time and place for everything. I am not interested in confrontation in Guyana. I have absolutely no interest in my studies and my experience in politics tells me where confrontation eventually ends up. But as my brother Deon said, you have a government that is bent on confrontation and it has the power and it is using the power to confront, then I think those who are at the mercy of the government, those who are victims of that confrontation, have a right to not be cowards and to stand up and defend their dignity in a country that they have contributed more than their numbers to their humanity and their dignity in the face of an assault by a state that is not stopping, it's not easing, then that is it's a politics of self-defense, not confrontation. I don't know that I'm pushing Aubrey Norton to anything, but it's a politics of self-defense against the might of the state. That's where I stand politically.
Okay, let's hear from Professor Terrance Blackman.
So actually, there are a couple of points I want to make at this place. So one, I hear there's echoes of a discussion that we had in the past about the sort of racial security / insecurity conundrum that we are facing. So I want to put a pin there, but I want to go back to, I think Ravi captured something. So in the preamble to this conversation, Deon and I were having a little pre-chat, and I think where I sort of confessed in a way that perhaps Dr. Hinds views himself in a more radical tradition. I suppose I view myself in a more pragmatic tradition, and so we don't disagree on ends in terms of dignity for people, in terms of folks being treated appropriately. I think what we disagree on is what the and I don't know that we disagree. I think I'm on my side. I want to amplify. I want to amplify a more pragmatic path to a more realistic. So I want to go back to this question that Ravi raised, and I want us to kind of make a note of it, and I want moderator to make note of it. So the question Ravi said, and I think it's an important one, is this question of how do you unpack equity for a 2023 game? Like, what would it mean to say, we have an equity agenda for a 2023 Guyana? So I want to label that point some. The second point I want to go to is what Dr. Hinds was just articulating. And I think, we have missed an opportunity in the post election kind of, I don't know how you describe the post-election chaos, post-election confusion. There was an opportunity there, I think, for some of what Dr. Hinds just described. Some sort of process that would maintain the broad constitutional integrity, but also it would the opportunity for a process that would sort of facilitate some kind of interim sharing of governance. And I think that there was an opportunity there for that, and to really think about some consensual path to a long-term sort of shared government dispensation that would kind of really go to codifying sort of Guyanese values, ambition, the patrimony, what it meant to move to 21st century. So I want to say that maybe I don't know right now that this is a path that can be taken, but I certainly do think that what Dr. Hinds just articulated was something that was possible, I think, in the post-election sort of moment in Guyana, when it wasn't clear what exactly would happen. And I think there was a moment there for calmer heads to sort of come to, because in a sense, what we're seeing now could have been predicted. We already know the kinds of weak institutions we have. We already know how the the education setup is unequal, how the health setup is unequal. So we already, and it's clear as we've articulated that if you win, this is the nature of the game that we're playing. If you win, then you have to. It is not a. It would be. You have to find a way to for lack of a better word, reward your constituents. So I think there are a couple of points, and I want us to hold to this business of unpacking equity for 2023. This is where I think is the path for us now. But I want to make one more point, and this goes to a somewhat sort of larger idea, and it's this sense, right? So everyone is talking about Afro-Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese, the Amerindian community, as Dr. Hinds notes, needs to be effectively integrated into the governing apparatus. But I think that this is the question: integrated into what? At core, and I think this is where I hope some part of our discussion is kind of we take for granted, but I don't know that it's proven that this winner-take-all political arrangement, this kind of republic grafting on the sort of British parliamentary democracy, is the thing that best serves Guyana, developing countries in general, and whether or not it serves Guyana in particular at this moment. And I think if one looks at the literature, there's really scant evidence of this kind of democratic success in multiracial, multi-ethnic contexts, and many experts on divided societies and constitutional engineering are sort of broad agreement to several points. They agree that these social divisions pose a grave problem for the democracy that we're describing. And you know and these problems are even there's a book which escapes me now, but it makes this argument that these problems are even greater in the countries that are not, you know, fully democratic. Like Guyana is not completely a sort of democratic place. And I would close my response to what I've heard thus far by saying, look, we've already seen this, right? You know, there was mention of Chetty Jagan and Forbes Burnham broadly agreeing on some things, and so then it made the argument about the direction sort of much easier. But I think that we should not forget that this sort of class-based commonality that allowed Chetty Jagan and Forbes Burnham to form the PPP collapsed at the first test.
That's right.
And so, and then we don't have to go far. We can see these things in Malaysia, Fiji, Indonesia, etc. So a steady list of doomed AFC parties, doomed third parties. So Deon's point about sort of the structural thing that is hard to get around is something that we have to take into consideration when we have this discussion. So I think, you know, what I want to say is, like, look, this thing that we're discussing is really the predominant political obstacle to a harmonious development for Guyana. And you know, if I'm a betting man, as a math person, I'm thinking of what's the probability that the political arrangements that we currently have will be able to effectively confront this dimension. I'm putting it at low odds. And so given that, I prefer to sort of take a more pragmatic road, go to Ravi's question and say, okay, look, we have a notion of equity, and let's see whether or not we can identify some places in Guyana in 2023 where we can make real this idea of equity. And so that's where I would want to push the discussion. And I hope it take too long.
Well, we have less than 25 minutes. So,
Wow.
so Ravi, can we unpack economic equity in 2023?
I think we can, and we must, absolutely must. I agree with all our panelists that we are at an inflection point. We have something which we never had before, the wherewithal to smooth out certain fluctuations. Money does make the world go round to a great extent, and we finally have some money. But I want to address, put it in this context, that in terms of that coalition which David talked about was possible after the 2020 election, I want to repeat, I was in the opposition. I am not a member of the PPP. I was never a member of the PPP. And after 2006, the party that entered parliament was called Gap Roar. It was not just Gap, it was between myself that had gone into a coalition with Gap. And throughout that term, I pleaded for the PNC to become more moderate against a host of others, including then Freddie Kissoon. I understand he's had a new incarnation, but then Freddie Kissoon, all of the known suspects, so to speak, including David, argued that the PPP was just going to roll over everybody. I said, no, I'm in the Indian community every single day at the grassroots. And I can tell you that it is not monolithic. There's a lot of discontent. So I argued for that. Lincoln Lewis, in fact, Eric Phillips said I'm betraying my earlier promise of consociational politics and so on and so forth. But I don't want to personalize this. The point is that when coalition talks started in 2010 or so, the Gap asked me, and I said my position is very clear. You need a coalition that can show itself to be moderate. And I want to remind David that the coalition got into power in 2015, explicitly declaring it is for power sharing, explicitly declaring that it would issue ethnic impact statement, explicitly declaring all of these things. This was not just going to be they want or it was aspirational. It was declarative statements. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. What I want to say is that this goes back to Horowitz's original problem with power sharing, which is called adoptability, whether the players will want to adopt it. And in Guyana, we see that both the PPP, and let's call it for what it is, the PNC, don't want to adopt it, even when it is handed to them, when the opportunity is handed to them, as in 2015. One would have thought, I wrote several articles in 2015, that the Ramharack administration should then reach across the divide, because in other parliamentary systems, there is precedent for that, including Canada, how they could have gone, but they insisted on ruling by themselves. The point I want to make is the question of adoptability of consociational power sharing is not a theoretical one in Guyana, it's a real one. Therefore, what do? I go back to what Dr. Blackman said. It has always been my position. We have to be pragmatic and work with what we have in governance. David disagrees with me. I am still grounded. Last week, my week was up to Ruby Bagdam, which is talking to farmers 5 miles in. And I can talk a little bit more about that. But every single day of the week, I am amongst ordinary Africans and ordinary Guyanese, but Africans in my village of Ifat, the history of my village. But the thing I want to make is that I can assure everyone, David would know that in sociology there's something called the inverse J curve, that rebellions against the ruling party, not rebellions in only an armed way, but opposition to the ruling party comes when there's an uptick in performance. And now that there is an uptick, it causes certain psychological changes. They want more. Are we getting more? When everybody were living in, Mark said, when everybody were living in huts, everybody's all right. But when you have a hut next to a palace, that's when you're going to have some problem. That's what's happening in Guyana. So in the Indian community, there are large swaths of people who have some issues. So I want to, but that's, David said, in a declarative way, that's not the way he feels things should go. So fine enough, let's see what the confrontational approach does. On the equity in economics, I want to take a simple thing that is on the table now. This government has declared that it wants to get to 1 million tons of rice export, up from the 600,000 tons that we did before last year, when it plummeted a little bit because of the weather. That is an opportunity. The 57 PPP government, the 64, was called the Koli Rice government because of Black Push Poll and what have you. Mr. Burnham, when he came in his first term, along with Degar, sought to rectify that, both in Black Push Poll, where he carved out a piece of Maibikuri, which is then called Zambia, to give farming. He put money into rice mills on the Essequibo coast, in Berbice, on West Coast, in Wakenham, and that money. The point I want to make, he also gave out land to African farmers. The MMA, go there and you'll see that the land was given, tremendous swaths of land was given to African farmers. Let us not go back, Mr. Burnham, by his own action, destroy the rice industry where there were no incentives for even African farmers to plant. They began to rent their land to Indian farmers who stuck to it for whatever reason. We won't go into that right now, even though it wasn't paying. The point is, at this juncture in our history, we have, and I was so happy that in the farmers that went to see the Minister of Agriculture to talk about their travails in rice last crop, they were African rice farmers and Indian rice farmers. I want to say this. David, last week I used the term of Booker T. Washington. Let's drop down our bucket right where we are. I'm sure all of us know where that anecdote comes from. That we may be surprised that in that case we were talking of 2 ships off the coast of Brazil that they didn't realize it was fresh water carried by the Amazon 200 miles offshore. So the analogy was, Booker T was saying, drop down your bucket. One captain of a ship told the other one. And the guy said, I want salt water. Drop down your bucket where you are. I am saying right now, whatever our suspicions about the PPP may or may not be, and the PPP has roar nose to its, how do I put it, not to its credit, but to its worst fears, plays hardball politics. But drop down your bucket. Let's take rice alone right now. Let us go to the African farmers and let us see why they cannot get back into paddy. Deon talks about Denham still. Let us get Denham still to plant those 600 acres that they bought after slavery. Why aren't they planting it? There must be some reasons. Let's find out, because rice still is a private crop. Everybody owns their own land or rents their own land. And why aren't all these swaths? Ivor Allen used to own huge amounts of acreage on the Essequibo Coast, had a rice mill there, right? Ivor and me sat in Parliament, in the 8th Parliament. Why isn't it happening? So come back to make it a concrete example. I want to know why is it. Let us go amongst the people and find out why they're not doing it, and let us assist them rather than harping upon why it ain't happening. Let us see how we can make it happen in a very pragmatic way, economically.
Deon, can we?
I don't know, the technical team, they wanted to show a short video. I don't know if we still have that on the cards.
I think that was in the background.
But we didn't. There wasn't any sound.
No, there was no sound.
So do we move ahead or?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Can we unpack economic equity in 2023?
Can we have?
Can we, as the question that Professor Blackman posed?
Look, possibilities are there for anything. All right. It depends on the will. And what the evidence that we are seeing is that there is no will. Ravi, I like the way he does things. He seems to always factor in a slant to things, suggesting that, well, there is more, that people are going to be contesting and quarreling for more. Are we getting our share and so on? But what is wrong with that? When you see, if we're talking about equity and add equality to that, that you see there is neither of the two in terms of what is taking place with the wealth that is in our hands. You know, I was looking at Al Jazeera only shortly before this program that we have here, and one of the economists in the program was discussing Egypt and Pakistan. And when we consider the fact that when we discussed our budget, we said that we needed infrastructure and all of that. And the guy was making the point that the same trap that we seem to be heading into, plugging a whole lot of money into infrastructure that is not going to generate income for the people, that is not going to increase the pool for labor in terms of, except when the constructions are taking place, but afterwards, you find that you spend so much money on these things and they have become unproductive now that Pakistan and Egypt are in a squalor. They're basically scrunting for survival, and it's the same road that we seem to be heading. But if we are going to talk about, you know, and there are so many sides to things, even with rice, you know, the Indians fell out of rice and so on. There is political interplay in all of that. We are aware of that. That canes were burned, that sabotage was a fact in during the Burnham era, but we don't talk about these things. All right, so you blame one side and you leave out the other side in terms of what really is at the root of our current situation. Black farmers are not in rice. I know for a fact. You go to Weldad and West Berbice and so on, and the farmers would tell me that look, when they plant, they don't have the machinery. If we give them the combines, we give them the equipment and so on, I'm sure they're going to plant. If we facilitate that, they don't have the resources to buy it now. The Indians have it. They are going to plow, rip all the Indians' rice and leave the Africans for the last, when their rice probably are falling off the stalks and so on. These are the stories that you hear, right? So I don't know what who Ravi speaks with.
But Deon, we don't know if it actually happened. You know, we really don't know if it actually happened.
Right? That's what I'm told when I go into these communities. I'm just relating. I don't know, right?
But look historically, Deon. Look here. As Marxists, we must look historically as to how they arrived at that situation. When Mr. Burnham destroyed rice, everybody, after Mr. Hoyt, it was Mr. Hoyt who accepted a Lacey to come in, and they opened up that European market in 1988-89, and that was a brand new market that was opened up and nobody had anything. Everybody was down and out. And when that European market was opened up through a technicality, when a Lacey could ship rice to Montserrat and pretend it's coming from a dependency, not Montserrat, from Guadeloupe, and pretend it's coming from a dependency of France and get into the European market, and that turned around the rice industry. Had nothing to do with government. Mr. Hoyt simply let the rice industry go where it is and allowed all the mills to be privatized. Lacey bought some, St. Vincent bought one on the coast, and so on and so forth. But the farmers themselves were just allowed to do their own thing. So whoever got combines now and whoever got, the one person that got government help in those days was Mr. Cayman Sankar by the PNC. You get me? Just like how BK got help under the PNC. So the thing is, boy, let me start now. I do it every day, and there are programs, for example, as to how small farmers. There's an app that is now sent out, and you can get on your how to learn accounting, how to keep records of what your inputs are, little things that farmers never knew. And I do this every day of the week on West Demerara, where I am, with farmers. And it doesn't cost me anything, except I'm going out this Sunday again. So all I'm saying, let me use what we got, drop our buckets where we are, and there's fresh water there. And let's not even think about the government.
All right, so listen, we got less than 10 minutes, so I'll ask each of you to make your final points within 2 minutes, please. You may answer the question as well. Can there be economic equity in a majoritarian winner-take-all political democracy?
I will need more than 2 minutes because you took away time from me.
We'll ask somebody to give you a little more. That would be Ramharack first. Ramharack first.
No. After death is me.
No.
After death is me. Right?
I'll go after David.
Go ahead, David.
Listen, it's interesting that Ravi is using Booker T. Washington, who is, as you know, reviled historically in the Black community. And Ravi is saying, put down your bucket and put down your bucket where you are and accept your second-class citizen. You forget that part of Booker T. Right?
No, I didn't forget it, David.
He's telling African Guyanese, look, accept this confrontational government. But you don't confront them in return. Don't defend yourself against them. Let your bucket down. Take the $20,000. Take the little crumbs that come in.
Plant your rice.
If they give Ravi, I'm amazed that Ravi is advising Black people to accept their second-class citizenship. And no, Ravi, we are not going to do that. No, you are talking about confrontation from the opposition. The confrontation comes from the government, and you are not addressing that confrontation. You are not, look, I didn't go to, hold on, Ravi, hold on. I didn't go to Buxton and tell them to do what they did in Buxton the other day. Norton didn't go there. Didn't go to Oaktown and tell them what they're doing. It's the natural instinct of people who are being hammered every day, and they will do things with or without politicians. And so therefore, unless we address the question of one-party governance today and what it is doing to our country in the age of oil money, we are not going to get any kind of equitability. Equitability doesn't come with one side surrendering and the other side saying, I am not going to govern in a weak way, I will govern in a strong way. What is more confrontational than that, Ravi? It is the president himself says that I demolish those houses in Moko because I don't want to look weak. I am being confrontational. What do people do when the state confronts them in that way? They don't need David Hinds and Aubrey Norton to think what you want us to do is to talk about neoliberalism and talk about Marxism and talk about all these things which have no direct bearing on what is going on today in Guyana. They may have indirect bearings, but not direct bearing. There is a racial confrontation that has ensued after the 2020 election. Dr. Blackman, David Hinds, and Vincent Alexander called for what you called for during the 5 months. We said this is an opportunity where both sides have decided to skin up one another. To say, you rig and you rig. And it was plain that both sides were involved in rigging. We said, this is the time for us to say, two teeth, may God laugh. Let us get together. Let us get together and form an interim government. Yes. All right? And let that interim government oversee a kind of transition towards a softer situation where we can work out our problems. Mr. Jagdio said, declare the elections, and then I will talk about that. The elections were declared, and like Ravi said, the coalition did. The PPP hasn't talked about that to this day.
So David, let that be the final word. I go to Ramharack.
Okay, so very quickly, I know we're coming up close to 9, but listening to Deon, as an Indian, I feel like I'm a constant target. You know, there are ways to deal with things and there are ways not to deal with things, right? When you are saying that this government is an apartheid regime or approaching a situation of being an apartheid regime, that is being confrontational. But a couple of quick points. I do want to say, one, 2020 was not or could not have been an occasion for compromise or accommodation from both sides. I think the sequence of events that we have seen and given previous events and knowing this was, as I say, the mother of all elections, it was difficult to see some kind of accommodation from both sides or power sharing or consociational arrangement or whatever you want to call it. I think that ship had sailed. Secondly, I believe, and I've said this before, that in terms of accommodation from both sides, I'm talking about the African and Indian side, we seem to forget that they're Amerindians. It is possible that we, since we have seen so much intervention in the 2020 election, it is possible that we may, for us to move closer to that point of conciliation, we may need to have outside intervention again, whether it's through the Carter Center or the United States or CARICOM. So that is something, that is a possibility because, again, we are a very divided nation, right? As they say, fish and cast net, can be friendly. And I think we're in that situation, because David keep throwing proverbs, so I figure I'd throw one on my own, So we've seen that division, right? And the next point I do want to make is that I don't think, as is being presented here, that the PNC is totally defenseless, right? They do have institutional power. We've talked about the army, police, and so on, right? One of the things, that they still have, which is street power. It was the protest in 1998 that forced the Janet Jagan government to reduce its term of office by 2 years. And that is something which they still possess, right? So that's power right there. And the other point I do want to make is this, which is that, when we talk about equity, we still have to remember, if you're going to talk about, let's say, Mocha, for instance, we seem to forget, right? Now, nobody wants, Army to put, their knees, Army officials on the necks of women. But we also seem to forget that the government has made attempt, right, to address the situation. And there are some people, who lived in that area who took advantage of whatever the government had to offer. So I think there is room here for conciliation. So we can't paint a picture that the opposition is totally helpless. This is an apartheid regime that doesn't care. My last point for tonight is this. We are less than 1 million people in Guyana, and the amount of wealth that we are going to see in the next 5 years, maybe we can, to Dr. Blackman, we may not see equity necessarily in 2023, but we are probably moving in that direction. And with the coming years, we are probably going to get to that point. And even if everybody in the government are wealthy and corrupt, there's going to be enough wealth to go around for everybody in Guyana. That is my sense. Now, I'm not saying the corruption is okay and all this nonsense that we see going on is okay. But I think there are opportunities here to work with this system. And I think the opposition has to get its act in order. The government. Right, exactly. We agree on that, right? So once we get to that point, we hopefully should have a meeting of the minds and we can work out. But I still want to leave the question here for David. I'm still confused about what you mean when you talk about equity. I want David to tell me, if you don't want to list 1, 2, 3, I want you to explain to me on a different show. What do you mean by saying that you want economic and political equity in this government in Guyana? So that would be another show.
The equity is part of us, and we can talk about those other things.
Not tonight. Let's hear Professor Blackman. Dr. Blackman.
So it's interesting that Baytoram raised the question of, so two points. It's interesting that Baytoram raised the question of the army, and actually today some private notes came to me around the person Omar Khan being appointed as the new chief of staff, and there were some questions about like the order in which things were done relative to, I know he had been acting in the post and so on. So even in this business of the army, there were some questions. This was something that was fairly done, and whether or not this was the most appropriate choice at this moment. So I say that to say that this is this is really the challenge that we're facing, sort of, and I want to put it on us. Sort of these issues require us to engage in self-reflection, to require us to engage in a certain kind of introspection, and to acknowledge each other and the things that we bring to the table, and to challenge kind of our own biases and assumptions about these questions of race. And I think that that's the point that I want to leave the discussion on. And then as we were listening there, just to close on Ravi's rights discussion, I quickly wondered, what was the, what was the value of the rice industry in Guyana? And so some quick searching, the rice industry is the equivalent of 200 million Guyana dollars in the year 2021. That's a significant sum. And I think that I would also like to see a situation where we begin to think in a very serious way about how we constitute the rice community with representatives of all of the groups in Guyana, so to share in the $200 million industry. So that's where I would like to end. And
let's go with Deon, and then Ravi will conclude.
But you see, the problem we have is the same thing that we have at the top and at the bottom. Even as we deliberate here, we see the differences playing out in terms of people holding a position in support of the side that they believe is, closer to them, right? There is no fairness there is, in some persons, you see a lack of objectivity. and it occurs right at the top, and it filters right down to the bottom. If we are going to achieve this equity, there must be will. And there is no demonstration of that will. When we talk about apartheid and so on, there is evidence of it, and people are seeming to deny that, the way the government approaches the management of the resources in this country is not one that is seeking to dominate and disenfranchise and to oppress and suppress and deny others access to the wealth that we have. Dr. Baytoram, I don't know that the idea that there is enough that everybody will get. If we look at the way things are in the world, it's not a magic thing. All right? It's not going to happen because money is there that everybody's going to get. There has to be a structured approach to the distribution of wealth. And if that is not taking place, it can be channeled in one direction as it's happening now. So I don't follow your reasoning in that direction, and I hope that something is done to change the trajectory that we are moving along right now.
Ravi, please conclude for us.
Well, in honor of my friend David's old philosophy of Marxism, I will remind him that the quantitative eventually can change into the qualitative. And coming back to, and seriously, I do believe that obviously we are not living in America. We don't have a majority of whites and Jim Crow laws and all the other things. So when I use Booker T's aphorism of 1896, so say drop down your bucket, he doesn't go with all the other factors in America. We're not in America. African Guyanese have held power here for 28 years. They held power for another 5 years. I do believe they can hold power if they play, quote unquote, the political game, to use Dr. Blackman's words, pragmatically. I do really happen to believe that. I'm not about to mama guy anybody. My whole life has been in opposition to the PPP and many of its policies. I would, for example, would still, as I did Mr. Hoyt, I encourage PPP to have ethnic caucuses, because people want to see in their party, to see real representation. Excuse this mama guy. So I want to end on this note that there is, when I say, and I think I want to expand on what Beto said, outside of what will be directed to infrastructure and other things, there is significant amount of money that is percolating into the communities. And if we work with our people to mobilize themselves, to exploit those opportunities, in sociology, there was an old equation that once the income level reaches a certain point, when I was a student, it used to be $5,000 US. But when that income, they begin to think much more independently for themselves. Right now, it's almost impossible to, they can be led by the nose because of their economic conditions. So I don't want to give up on our people. What is in our head, is to a large extent shaped by these other forces. But within that window of opportunity that they have, we can empower them. And I do believe the quantitative, we can change enough of them. Within the next 5 years, we can see changes at the macro level. And I just want to say, let's not give up on our people, all our people. Again, I want to say that I'm from Iflut. Iflut is a mixed villages, and I grew up on the section called Kashmir. And I know for a fact that at the base, we are one people. It took me to when I went to America to discover that whatever the divisions we are here, we are more like each other as Guyanese than in our ethnic differences. It is just that the circumstances have conspired to accentuate those ethnic differences for other reasons. But if we just focus within what is in front of us, I do believe we can come out of that and we can become truly independent.
On that note, that we are all one people, ladies, gentlemen, I'm sorry to say that we have to close. We are about 8 minutes beyond time. Thank you all very much, Professor Terrance Blackman, Professor David Hinds, Professor Baytoram Ramharack, Deon Abrams, and Mr. Ravi Dev. Thank you all. Good night. I got to run as well.
Good night.